to facilitate that at the end for questions. So make sure that you get those in while we listen to our speaker. Couple upcoming events for the chamber. Just want to give a shout out to our Rising Professionals group. They're doing great and hosting lots of events. So for those of you who don't know that we have a Rising Professional group, if you're interested or know somebody that is interested in participating in that group, please let us know. They do have an upcoming event, a coffee hour with Black Hawk Technical College on Friday, January 29th at 8 o'clock. That will be a Zoom meeting. I think Maggie's going to share some links for you on that if you are interested in attending. And then also just information about the chamber, once again, for those of you who are not members on the call, if you want to find out some more information on the chamber, she'll share a link with that. So without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our keynote, Mike. Mike Hahn is an associate attorney with Nowlan Mouat in Janesville, with an emphasis on litigation and regulatory matters. He is also a former lobbyist and Wisconsin Supreme Court clerk with extensive knowledge of statutory interpretation and administrative regulation. In addition to his trial experience, Mike has helped guide clients through permitting and enforcement matters with local municipalities, the Wisconsin DNR and the DATCP. At the federal level, Mike has also represented business and employers through EPA and OSHA enforcement actions. Mike is a native to Clinton and currently lives in Evansville with his wife and children. Mike, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, Amy. And, thank you first of all, to the chamber for inviting me to come in and kind of give a brief overview of what are the legalities and what are the requirements for resuming in-person events, as hopefully we are at the hopefully tail end of this pandemic. And really there's been a lot of activity in the last week, and certainly in the last even 24 hours, that has a significant impact on the risks and the requirements for doing that those in-person events. So I am going to go ahead and start the PowerPoint that I have for you guys. So let me see if I can get it to actually there we go. So the legal liability changed significantly in the last basically 24 hours. Earlier this week and last week, the state legislature was considering AB 1, which is basically the state COVID relief bill. And through negotiations between the Senate and the Senate president and majority leader and the governor, they were able to reach a compromise bill that the Senate passed late last week, and just last night the Assembly and Senate agreed on a compromise bill that indications are Governor Evers will sign. And in that bill, one of the key provisions for in-person events is a legal liability exemption for businesses, businesses, associations, nonprofits, pretty much anybody, for the exposure to COVID-19. The exemption is retroactive to March 1st, 2020. And again, applies to any business, association, governmental entity, school, institution of higher education, nonprofit organization, or some other legal entity. So the only thing it doesn't apply to is individual people. So if your business is hosting something, or your organization is hosting something, there should be legal liability or legal liability exemption. The specific language that's going to be in here that is set to become law is what I have quoted here on this slide, that beginning back to March 1st, 2020, You're immune from civil liability for death, injury to any individual, or damages caused by an act or omission resulting in or relating to exposure, directly or indirectly, to COVID-19 in the course, excuse me, in the course of or through the performance or provision of your functions or services. This is exceptionally broad. It's covering any potential exposure that, whether it's customers, clients, employees, things of that nature, where you're going to have, you're going to have an exemption from liability for being sued that, oh, hey, I caught, for basically somebody coming in and saying, hey, I caught COVID at your event, or I got COVID at your restaurant or something like that. There's now a shield here. There is an exception. It doesn't apply to reckless or wanton or intentional conduct, but simple non-compliance with national, state, or local rules doesn't constitute reckless or wanton conduct on the part of a business. That really leaves kind of an open question of how broad and how bad conduct has to be in order to lose this liability exemption. I think that's, that hopefully won't be something that gets litigated, and hopefully won't be something that comes up. But I think the purpose here is basically to make it clear that if you're a business or a school or a nonprofit or any type of a legal entity that's just trying to survive through the pandemic by staying open or providing services, you're going to be okay. Unless you do something truly just boneheadedly stupid. And I think you're going to be fine. As long as you're not intentionally exposing or allowing employees that to be COVID positive to then interact with, customers or clients, I think you're probably going to be okay. So this is a very, very broad liability exemption. And because it's retroactive, anything that happened in the last 9 months is going to be covered, and it's forward looking as well. So as we are near the end here, and people are starting to get vaccinated, if we have in-person events again, as long as you're not doing something where you're knowingly allowing COVID positive individuals to interact with the general public, I think you're going to be fine. And that's a big change just in the last, in the last couple of days. So that provides an exemption. The other big thing, though, is, going beyond the liability exemption, is there are still state and local rules that businesses, even though to get the liability exemption, you may not have to follow them, you're probably still going to want to follow them just because it's a best practice for your business. Big change on the current mask mandate imposed by Governor Evers. Yesterday, the state Senate voted to revoke the executive order, which is the basis for the mask mandate. And the state assembly announced that it is going to vote on the joint resolution tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Given the partisan makeup of the state assembly, it is very likely that the current executive order, emergency declaration, and the current mask mandate are going to be revoked. The state legislature essentially has a veto over emergency declarations by the governor. It's pretty clear in the statute that I cite there, 332310. It's an emergency declaration is in effect for 60 days unless revoked by either the governor or by a joint resolution of the legislature. That's what the state Senate did yesterday and what the state assembly is likely to do tomorrow. So there will not be any statewide regulations regarding masking and social distancing as of tomorrow. But
Mike,
yes.
Mike, can I just jump in on that one?
Yes.
Can you talk about, though, in regards to that, is there still things that the counties can do on the
Yes.
mask mandate and that we would still have to follow, or they can do it, we wouldn't have to follow it? Like, what is the difference there?
Yeah, so that's exactly the next part that I was gonna go to, is that.
Oh, perfect.
So,
Sorry.
no, that's okay. That's a perfect question. So that's legislation at the state level. So we've got, it looks like we're going to have liability exemption, so you don't have to worry about getting sued for somebody getting exposed to COVID while at your event or while at your business. There's not going to be a statewide mask mandate anymore, but those are statewide provisions. Those are statewide issues. The local regulations, so the city of Beloit's regulation ordinance, the county and local entities can still impose regulations, and they still can impose mask mandates and social distancing requirements. The question then really becomes, is there a penalty or an enforcement to it? If you recall, when the original stay-at-home order was struck down back in May by the Supreme Court, the Rock County and the city of Beloit and a few other surrounding counties instituted their own either stay-at-home order or social distancing requirements, things of that nature. Rock County's has always been essentially guidance. It's not mandatory. It's not something that they're going to, while they're recommending it and they're suggesting everybody should follow it, they're not going to enforce it. So the Rock County's position has essentially been, these are what we think is the best course of action for public health. This is what we think you should do, but we're not going to enforce it by citations or fines or anything like that. That is a little bit different than the city of Beloit. The city of Beloit's mandate is, an ordinance is still in effect. So mask mandate and physical distancing, social distancing is still required under the city of Beloit's ordinance. But, and that is something that is going to be enforced via the standard ordinance enforcement provision in their municipal code. So that's something that you could get a business or individuals could get cited for if they violate those. Now, the specific regulations for the city of Beloit are very similar to what Governor Evers had in place in the mask mandate, where it's a requirement for masks, it's a requirement for social distancing. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that while they discourage mass gatherings, so a mass gathering is defined in the ordinance as a gathering of 25 people or more, that's strongly discouraged, but it's not prohibited. Mass gatherings on city property or in government buildings, that is prohibited. But if it's at a private, venue or a private entity, you can still technically under the ordinance have a mass gathering, provided there is masking and physical or social distancing along with it. So the state, we've got issues with the statewide mandates being repealed, but that doesn't affect the local municipalities or counties from imposing their own. There's also the CDC guidelines. These are just guidelines. They're not rules that are going to be enforced under any penalties or citations, but the local regulations, like the City of Beloit's ordinance, basically follows CDC guidelines and Department of Health Services, so state DHS guidelines. So those are still things that I think you should keep in mind for maybe looking at for best practices, or looking at in terms of whether or not how you want to structure in-person events so that people feel comfortable doing it. If you're following CDC guidelines, or if you're following the City of Beloit ordinance, it might make for a better turnout at your event, because people will feel comfortable going. But key thing is statewide regulation and civil liability is now gone. And you don't have to worry about, gosh, okay, if people aren't social distancing, or if people don't want to wear a mask and somebody gets exposed, am I going to get in trouble? And I think as long as Governor Evers signs that legislation, which I think he's going to, you're going to be okay. It really, at this point, comes down to what best practices are and what you feel comfortable, what risk you feel comfortable taking. And I think the best practice is you just look back at what are the local regulations, if any, and then what are the CDC and DHS guidelines. And if you're kind of following those to the extent feasible, I think you're going to be in a good position for having in-person events. And that really then just what kind of considerations you want to go through in terms of what kind of an event is it? Is it an actual event, or is it just you're reopening your business now? You're actually, you feel comfortable now reopening to having customers or clients in your offices, in your store, in your restaurant, and rather than just doing everything by remote, or doing things where it's just takeout or to-go orders, things of that nature. Then where are you going to hold it? If you're in the City of Beloit, you got to make sure that you're following the guidelines that are set forth in the ordinance. You got to make sure that you're complying with those limitations. If you're outside the City of Beloit, you've still got CDC guidelines and DHS guidelines to consider, but those aren't going to be enforced against you. So you don't have to, as a legal matter, comply with those. Then it's just kind of more on that end, it's more of a logistical thing. How many people are you expecting? Is your venue large enough so you can social distance? How would you work logistics for food and drink, things like that? And really, I think we're getting to the point now where with the vaccines, the lack of a statewide mandate on masking and social distancing, it really is going to come down to what's your comfort level? What's your comfort level for you and your staff, you and your employees, and your attendees or your customers and clients. And that's unfortunately something that we can help you run through the kind of the things to consider and some of the regulation or some of the guidelines. But that's ultimately a decision that you have to make for your own business. I did also, now a lot of this, of the information I was planning on talking about and some of the other considerations kind of all blew up in the last, like I said, in the last week with the liability change and the repeal of the mask mandate, which, at least on the liability exemption, I think that's a really good thing for Wisconsin and for businesses and events, associations, so that you can get back to more of a normal setting faster without having to worry about, gosh, what happens if somebody gets sick, or what happens if somebody who is sick comes to my event and now we're essentially ground zero for a super spreader event. One thing, I think, again, as long as you're in the state of Wisconsin, it looks like you're going to have the liability protection, but we are right on the state line, and we are right across the border from Illinois, which has a completely different regulatory setup. And so there are things to consider in terms of how big an event you're having. If do you want to do liability waivers, just to kind of a belt and suspenders approach with the change in the in state law? Do you want to also just say, hey, look, we're having this event, and this is, when you come to this, we're going to have food and drink, we're going to have people interacting, we can't maintain perfect social distance or perfect mask compliance. So you're acknowledging as an attendee that there is a risk of COVID exposure, and as an attendee, I agree not to sue you as the event organizer or host if I get COVID. I think those are, those are still an option. They're always going to be a little tricky on enforcement, because there are some courts that will uphold them and some courts that won't, depending on how they're written. If they're too broad, courts are going to throw them out as against public policy. So you want to make sure that they're narrowly tailored. But again, it's going to be that would be an additional layer of protection. But at this point, it's not something that's necessarily a requirement, or necessarily something that you're going to have to do, provided Governor Evers signs the COVID relief bill as he said he would. So a couple other things that I think may be on some of your minds in terms of insurance, liability insurance for potential issues. That's kind of a gray area. Most general liability policies have exemptions for bacteria and viral outbreaks, things of that nature. So, kind of the, act of God result of a pandemic isn't necessarily going to be covered in a standard general commercial liability policy. There are, to the best of my knowledge, there are some rider policies or additional policies that you can get to try and cover potential damages or liability from COVID exposure or business interruption due to COVID. But those are going to be specific to the types of policy, insurance policies you have. And I don't think, to the extent that you're looking at a true, in-person event where it's a one-off type of thing, where it's, an open house or a fundraiser, things like that, there are insurance policies you can get for those types of events. I don't know if you're going to be able to insure against something like a global pandemic, though. But that would at least be worth exploring if you have to have it in Illinois, or you have to have it somewhere other than the state of Wisconsin, where you're going to have that liability protection. Are there any, I guess right now, are there any questions or anything like that that anybody has specific to any of the information. I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you guys, but you know, we want to make sure we're covering everything that may be out there.
Mike, I did have a couple questions.
Yeah.
And I if any of it was already talked about, I always say a little repeat is no harm. So
Nope.
First one, is there any assumption on protection of health for participants or exposure to liability for an organization holding an event that requires a registration participation fee?
I think that's still going to be covered. I don't think there's any the way the liability exemption is written, it's retroactive to March 1st. It's any entity, so it's death, injury, damages that result or are related to in any way exposure to COVID-19. I don't think there's any as long as you're doing a normal function for your business or your organization, so it's related to the functions or services you provide. I think you're going to be covered whether it's just an open house where people can come in or people have to pre-register, whether it's free or paid. I think this is written broadly enough where it's going to cover the whole spectrum of those types of situations.
Sure. It sounds like you're pretty familiar with the City of Beloit's ordinance. Do you know, are they still restricting mass gatherings over 25, or have they loosened that number?
They are strongly discouraging it. They do not outright prohibit mass gatherings over 25 people, but I'm looking at the most recent version right now, and mass gatherings are defined as those planned or spontaneous events with a large number of people, such as a concert, festival, conference, or sporting event. And mass gatherings of more than 25 people are strongly discouraged. Does not say, however, that they are outright banned. Mass gatherings, to the extent that they do happen, are required to still comply with the masking and social distancing requirements. So there is potential liability there, where okay, you can have a mass gathering, but make sure you have a big enough space where you can people can be social distanced, and requiring masking except when, and there's a few exceptions to the masking requirement. So when you're consuming food or beverages, as long as you're still social distance, you can take it off. Things like that, where kind of common sense, the common sense things where you can't do certain activities with a mask on, but again, make sure that you're still providing that social distancing capability.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I understand non-masking and social distancing at certain events, but we host grief support groups where people often cry, need to blow their noses, etc. What bearing does that have on best practices? I'm struggling to see how we're going to be able to host events like that anytime soon.
So that there's not a specific exemption for that under the Beloit ordinance, which is unfortunate, because it makes it, like you said, it makes it difficult to provide those. If you're outside of the city of Beloit, though, and to my knowledge, Janesville and the rest of Rock County does not have a requirement for masking and social distancing. They may have recommendations, they may have suggestions or guidelines, but they're not enforcing it to my knowledge. So if you're outside of the city of Beloit, or if you're outside of a jurisdiction that has a masking and social distancing requirement, I think once the governor's the current mandate by the governor is revoked, I think you can resume those. The logistical things that are going to go into that, for making sure people are comfortable in those settings, making sure people are able to attend, that's going to be something that I think you would still want to take a look at and want to make sure that you're taking precautions to the extent possible. But I don't think you're going to be banned from having those, or effectively banned from having those types of events like you are under the current mask mandate.
Yeah, makes sense. We talked a little bit about the differences between Wisconsin and Illinois, the different mandates, and so hosting events would be different if you cross the border. But does it matter if someone from the other state, Illinois, comes to an event here? Which state laws are followed?
So the way the liability exemption is written, and I'm looking at the text of the bill right now, it looks broad enough where it's just going to cover, if you're in Wisconsin, it should be, if you're in Wisconsin. I don't think it's going to matter where they come from, because the exposure. So if you think of it like a car accident or something like that, think of it like a more normal personal injury event or tort. Generally speaking, the lawsuit is filed where the accident occurred or where the exposure occurred. If that's the case, it would, even if somebody comes up from Illinois, and this is with the big caveat that I haven't looked at to see if Illinois has any state laws that would change this, but my assumption would be that the Wisconsin law would apply, because that's where the alleged harm occurred. That's where the alleged exposure occurred. So I think you should be okay once this is signed into law. But to piggyback on that, one thing that I want to make clear is that, so the immunity granted by this bill it's in addition to, it's a blanket immunity. So if there's, this is in addition to, say, recreational immunity or things like that, other potential protections you would have under the law. One thing it doesn't do, though, and I think this is important to point out, is it doesn't affect any regulations or authority that federal entities would have. Now, currently, there aren't any federal mandates regarding masking or social distancing. There aren't any federal mandates requiring people to engage in social distancing and things like that. But with one major exception that I think is important to remember, and this isn't so much an event situation, it's an employment situation, where if you're covered by OSHA, if you have to comply with OSHA regulations, earlier in the pandemic, when, if everybody recalls, when there were the outbreaks at the meatpacking plants throughout the Midwest, and including some in Green Bay, OSHA did do an investigation of that, and they did actually fine those meatpacking plants, and some pretty significant fines. I think it was well over $100,000 under what's called the general duty clause for OSHA. it's basically a catch-all provision that you have to maintain as safe a place as possible for your employees. That's an open question as to how broadly OSHA is going to interpret that, or how aggressively OSHA is going to interpret that. Again, that's on the employment side. So if you have a facility that you have to be open, that workers have to be there, you're going to want to make sure that you're doing what you can to follow best practices set out by CDC and DHS, so that you don't, if there is an outbreak, you don't risk potential exposure on OSHA. But again, that's a separate thing that hopefully not many people are going to have to worry about.
Okay, makes sense. The next question I think is pretty similar to the people coming over for events. I think you answered it, but what companies with several locations, they have the locations in Rat, Green, Walworth. Do we, as a best practice, follow one policy based on the location of the headquarters, or is it based on the location of each location?
I would make sure that you're following, as much as possible, uniform best practices. So try and be as uniform across your locations as you can. Now, that also depends on if there are local regulations that are mandatory for compliance. So things like the City of Beloit ordinance, that's a mandatory compliance. Rock County's they're guidelines, they're not mandatory. So to the extent that your locations, which with being in Walworth County, there's probably not going to be any. They're a little bit more loose in terms of their regulations than even Rock County. I don't know about Green, but you want to have as close to consistent as you can, and just because it's going to make compliance and enforcement of those best practices that much easier. But I would also then, if you're going to do that, look at what are the most restrictive regulations that you have. So if one of your locations is in Beloit, you're going to have to follow those. If that's the case, is it feasible to have those apply company-wide? Or is it, okay, we can make it work in Beloit, but for the other locations, we're going to do something a little bit different, just because otherwise it's costing too much productivity or too much employee time or whatever. So I think those are just kind of the considerations you're going to want to have, but I'd keep them as close to uniform as you can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Next question. We're looking to host a large fundraiser in September. Would you recommend requiring temp takers and health questions prior to people arriving at the event? I understand that things will change between now and
then. Hopefully, let's knock on wood that the production of the vaccines and distribution will ramp up here, and everybody will be vaccinated to the point of herd immunity, so we won't have to worry about that come September. But I think that's something to consider as you're going, as it gets closer. If this, I think that's hopefully something that you can make a decision on, maybe as we get into the summer, where we're, instead of being 8 months out, we're, 3 or 4 months out, and see what kind of a change that has, that has taken place in that time. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. But it may not be something that's necessary once we actually get there. And hopefully that's something that can easily be adapted as we get closer and we get a better sense of where things are on the ground. From a legal standpoint, is it, I guess, or is this usually a fundraiser that's held indoors, or is it an outdoor event? Do we know?
I am not sure.
Well, if it's so say it's an outdoor event. Let's just go through both potential options. If it's an outdoor event, I wouldn't think it would be necessary to do that, just because the transmission is much less outdoors. It's easier to social distance outdoors. If you have a masking requirement for people who haven't received the vaccine, that's probably enough and certainly enough to get the civil liability exemption. If it's indoors, then I think then a lot depends on what the current conditions are and where things are at in terms of transmission rates, where things are at in terms of what percentage of the population is vaccinated. Because if you've got 70% of the population has been vaccinated, your risk is much lower. And I don't think those steps would be necessary to meet the qualifications for the liability exemption. Whether or not you think it's necessary to do that so you're maximizing the number of people who actually come to the event, that's something that's going to be, you're just going to have to wait until you're closer to know what are the facts on the ground at that point.
Yeah, a lot of it will come down to best practices and what you, like you said before, what you decide to do as a company for best practice.
Right. I don't think you're going to, even if your event was next week, I don't think, provided the governor signs the bill, and again, he said he would, I'm just saying, provided he does, because he hasn't done it yet. If he signs the bill, though, I don't think you'd have to do it even now. You may want to, because it'll make people feel better. I think it'll give people that peace of mind that you want them to have, but it wouldn't be legally necessary. And so I think that's really just, hopefully that's something that you don't have to start, you can plan for it now, make sure that you have the potential to do it if you ultimately decide to. But at the end of the day, but right now, I hopefully that's something that you can make a final decision on late enough where, we'll see how things go for the next 5 or 6 months.
I was gonna joke with you, the plan on it. That's hilarious coming from from event planners these days. There's no planning anymore.
Yeah, it's basically, it's a whole new world for stuff, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
When it comes to events involving food, for example, if we're looking to do an open house event outdoors at our new office location this summer, maybe spring, with food service at an event like that, would it matter if it was commercially provided, caterer versus food truck, or for example, a large grill, them serving it up?
Again, for purposes of the liability exemption, I don't think it does, because you're providing an open house, you're doing an open house for your business, you're having people, you're having your clients, your customers, come in. As long as you're not being reckless, I think you're fine. If you want to have it catered, I think the easiest way is to try and there are CDC regulations related to food, and making sure that the food is individually packaged to the extent possible, that you don't have people limiting like community type food. I'm just going to double check. I don't know if there is I don't think there's a specific provision in the Beloit ordinance either, but I think I think for that, it's again, what are you comfortable with? And if you want to go a grilling option where you're essentially doing a cookout for, the open house, just make sure, try and take a look at the CDC guidelines for food service, because there are guidelines specific to it. Take a look at those, take a look at the DHS guidelines. The state DHS website is actually pretty good for, making those searchable, and just kind of look at that and see, okay, is this something that we can do without, making it more difficult than it's worth? And I think, just kind of, probably for the most part, common sense food safety, if you're the one making the food, if you're, whoever you got making the food, make sure they're wearing a mask, make sure they're wearing gloves, make sure everything's been wiped down and sanitized, try and, limit the real close together service options, things like that. But I think either way, you're going to be good. And if you want to be safer, if you want to be on the safe side, just follow what the CDC has put out for those situations.
Yeah, that's the most important point, is follow your state regulations, your local community regulations, and the CDC. Just check all those places before you decide to do anything.
Yep. And again, you don't, to get the legal liability exemption, you don't have to do that. It's explicit in the statute that you don't have to. But if you want to be able to say, okay, we know this is going to be okay, people are going to have, after almost a year of this, I think everybody's a little bit gun shy when they see, if I'm out at a grocery store or something like that, and I happen to see somebody that isn't wearing a mask, you do a double take, because it's, oh, hey, I haven't seen anybody that hasn't worn a mask. It's just, you do a double take, because it's just something different, because we've gotten, for better or worse, accustomed to this current situation. And so at that point, you're looking at, okay, one, what's going to keep people the safest? We all want to make sure that our staff, our attendees, our customers, that they're all safe. That's going to be something that we all want. And so then, okay, what's the best way to do that? And what's the best way to give people peace of mind that we're doing it? And that's where, just take a look at just double check the guidelines, and to the extent feasible, go ahead and follow them.
Maggie, you want to share the results of that poll with us quickly before we say goodbye? Thank you.
Everybody should be able to see that now.
Yep. So 48% are somewhat likely to attend an event in the next 3 months, but still have a lot that are not sure. For sure. Okay, well, with that, I don't see any other questions, so we will let Mike enjoy the rest of his day. Please stay tuned for more of these business studios. We plan to keep doing these and try to bring relevant information to you. So if you need to get on our newsletter list, please contact us, and so that we can share more of these events with us. Thank you again to Mike, and thank you all for attending and engaging in the questions with us. We really appreciate it. Everybody have a great afternoon.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.